Between the Worlds. Jack's Incredible Adventures. Prologue. Jack stood on the rim of the Tycho crater, watching as the sun slowly sank behind the horizon. It was a beautiful sight, but he was not here to take a vacation. The human colony on the moon had a problem, and Jack was the man to solve it. Or at least, that's what he thought. He had just recently gotten a position on the moon and was now the technical manager of the local repair team. He glanced at his datapad and read the message that had sent him to the moon. It was a short but concerning note from a colleague. The life support systems of the colony have a malfunction. We need you here. Jack sighed and took off his tool belt. It was another one of those days where he had to struggle with his impulsiveness. But he was here to do his job, and that's what he would do. On the way to the base, Jack decided to make a detour to the crater rim to take a selfie. When he reached the rim, he could hardly wait to take his selfie. He stood at the edge and looked proudly at the landscape. But then it happened. One of his boots slipped on a smooth rock and Jack lost his balance. He fell down the steep crater, sliding on his back across the dusty ground. Jack tried to cling to anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. He hit the ground hard and continued to roll down the crater. Finally, he came to a stop and Jack got up. His spacesuit was covered in dust and he had a few scratches, but he was in one piece. He looked up at the crater rim and wondered how he would ever get back up there. Great, he muttered as he got up and dusted off his spacesuit. This is sure to be a great start to my new job. Chapter 1. The Strange Emergency Call. Upon arrival at the station, he was greeted by his colleagues. They laughed and joked. Jack smiled and shook their hands. What's going on here? He asked. We just received a message from Mission Control. They asked us to bring you to the control room. They want to talk to you. Jack followed his colleagues to the control room and sat in front of the screen. Mission Control connected and explained to him that there was an emergency. One of the relays that supplied the station with energy had failed and needed to be repaired urgently. You need to go to the other side of the colony with the rover, came from the Mission Control operator. Jack nodded. Of course. I'm ready immediately. He was ready to use his skills as a technician to get the relay back in operation and prove to everyone that he deserved his place on the team. Jack sat in the cockpit of the rover, which was to bring him to the moon base. The suit he was wearing was a bit tight, but he was ready for the challenge. Jack looked out the window at the barren, rocky landscapes of the moon as they passed by. He was an experienced astronaut and had already been on several missions. Still, he felt a tingling in his stomach as he thought about what lay ahead. Would he be able to avoid disappointing his colleagues? He drove at high speed through the lunar landscape, passing by unusual formations of stones and craters repeatedly. Jack took a deep breath and focused on the task ahead. He knew he had to give his best to complete the mission successfully. Suddenly, a signal shook the cockpit and Jack was pulled out of his thoughts. The rover began to skid and Jack struggled for control. The alarm systems blared and Jack knew something was wrong. An emergency signal appeared on his datapad and it was not far from his route. I need to check that out, Jack thought. Soon after, he saw it, a strange, unidentifiable machine that was off the path to the destination. Without considering the dangers, Jack decided to investigate the machine. What could this be? He asked himself aloud. A new space toy for wealthy people? A new technology that will show us the way to the stars? He parked the rover next to the machine and got out. As he approached, he realized that the machine not only looked odd, but also emitted a strange humming sound. Well, let's see what we have here, said Jack and reached for his tool. But when he touched the machine, something completely unexpected happened. The world around him started to spin and blur, and suddenly Jack found himself in a completely alien place. What the hell is going on here? Jack shouted as he looked around, trying to orient himself. I must have watched too many science fiction movies. Where the hell am I? Jack asked loudly as he looked around. Jack was initially completely confused and overwhelmed by his new surroundings. Everything around him seemed so foreign and unfamiliar. But where the hell was he? He began to look around more closely and realized that he was in a strange city filled with incredible buildings and flashing lights. Jack was stunned by what he saw and couldn't help but make some witty comments. "Wow, I'm definitely not on the moon anymore," he said, laughing and at the same time worrying. In his desperation, he wondered how he was ever going to get back home. But Jack was also a man with a lot of thirst for adventure and curiosity. So it didn't take long for him to start exploring the new surroundings and adjusting to the new reality. He examined the strange buildings and machines around him and commented with witty remarks like, "This technology is simply incredible. I can't believe I forgot my camera." Despite his initial despair, Jack was excited by his new discovery and couldn't wait to find out more about it. His impulsiveness and thirst for adventure had once again put him in an incredible situation, but this time he was ready to explore everything and find out what the future held for him. Chapter 2. Intergalactic Small Talk. He had no choice but to explore his surroundings and find out where he had landed. Jack walked through the streets and for the first time encountered the local residents of the place. They were quite strange beings that Jack met. They looked like glowing pink clouds with a shadowy body. Although they don't have hands or clear body shapes, they still seem to radiate a form of intelligence. Their bodies wafted and changed constantly, as if they were made of a gaseous substance. The beings seemed to radiate a certain peace, but also a mysterious aura, as if they have meaning behind their movements. Jack felt both fascinated by their beauty and disturbed by their strangeness. He looked around the strange environment again and still couldn't accept that he had landed here. Great, he thought to himself. Just because I turned the wrong way once, I ended up in another world. Everything around him was so different from what he had ever seen. His first reaction was to turn around and run as far as his legs would carry him, but his curiosity prompted him to stop and find out where he is. Unfortunately, he couldn't recognize any familiar landscapes or buildings. Instead, he was swarmed by a series of these strange beings. Jack felt as if they were watching him curiously. Great, as if it wasn't strange enough here, I have to meet aliens too, muttered Jack as more and more of the beings appeared around him. His gaze wandered from one being to another. What is wrong with this day? Can't I just repair a simple malfunction without it turning into an intergalactic adventure? Thought Jack desperately. The beings stared at Jack and were no less confused than he was. Despite his confusion, Jack remained calm and closely watched the beings. He realized that they were not necessarily hostile to him and decided not to attack them. Instead, he tried to make contact with them and understand their intentions. "Okay, let's try to communicate with each other," he said as he approached one of the beings and made gestures. "It's a good thing that I was in the Scouts," he added with a wink to the being. Jack started making strange faces and making loud, silly noises in the hope that the creatures would understand him and he could make contact with them. But unfortunately, the creatures did not understand Jack's behavior and were confused and frightened by his efforts. Some of them fled from him, while others looked at him with mistrust and dislike. Some, on the other hand, started ignoring Jack. Jack quickly realized that his impulsive behavior was not going to benefit him here and that he had made a mistake. But Jack was persistent and continued to try to make contact with the creatures. It did not take long for him to realize that he was making a fool of himself and that his efforts would be unsuccessful. Jack couldn't help but laugh at himself in this absurd situation. Who would have thought that my career as an international sign language superstar wouldn't go as planned? Jack thought. After many failed attempts, he realized that this was not an easy task and that he was slowly but surely losing his mind. Jack was about to be driven mad when he finally met one of the creatures who looked like a scientist. It wore a belt with unidentified tools and a cloak that looked similar to that of a scientist from Earth. This one seemed understanding and willing to help Jack. Jack sighed with relief and hoped that he would finally get answers to his questions. Chapter 3. Communication at Intergalactic Level. Jack and the scientist being found themselves in a large room. The walls were filled with shelves on which countless devices and instruments stood. A long table on which papers, writing materials, and a few high-tech devices were lying divided the room in the middle. The ceiling was high and arched, with fluorescent lights spreading a cold, even light. On the walls, large screens were hanging on which data, graphs, and diagrams blinked. It smelled of oil, metal, and electronics. Jack couldn't hide his surprise when he entered the laboratory. Wow, he thought to himself, if this isn't a high-tech paradise, then I don't know what is. He looked around and saw the scientist being. Looks like I found my new friend, he muttered and went over to him. The two began to work to overcome the language barrier. However, it was a long and arduous process, as they had no common understanding. Jack tried to ease the tense situation with a few jokes, but the scientist being's reactions were not always positive. How can I understand anything if I have no idea what you're saying? Joked Jack when he didn't understand a long and complicated explanation from the scientist being. However, the scientist being just looked at him impatiently and gave him another explanation, which was even more complex than the previous one. Okay, let me try to understand this my way, said Jack and took out a pen and a notebook. Just give me a few keywords so I can get an idea of what we're talking about. The scientist being looked at Jack with amazement, but eventually gave in and helped him understand a few important concepts. Over time, they were able to develop a sort of common language, and they could finally communicate with each other. This is great, Jack exclaimed as they had their first successful conversation. Now we can finally get some answers to my questions. The scientist being nodded in agreement, and the two continued their collaboration to find out how Jack could get home. It was still a long way, but they had finally made a start. Chapter 4. Worlds Meet. Jack meets Azure. Finally, Jack said, extending his hand to the creature. I'm Jack. It's nice to meet you. The creature recoiled and replied, I am Azure. Unfortunately, it could not return Jack's gesture as it simply lacked hands. Jack felt like a fool. It was not his intention to offend the creature. He had just acted automatically and extended his hand in all the excitement. The two looked at each other for a while until Jack tried to ease the situation by making a joke. I need a coffee. Is there a Starbucks around here? But Azure only looked at him with his piercing gaze and asked, Who or what are you and where do you come from? Jack shrugged. Good question. I don't know myself. I was on a mission and then, well, here I am. Jack told Azure the entire story of how he was on his way to the other part of the colony and what he found along the way. Azure nodded understandingly. I understand, but I can't register any similar life forms on my home world. Are you perhaps from another dimension? Jack shook his head. I don't think so. Or maybe. I have no idea how I got here. Azure frowned and pondered the information. Interesting. I think we should find out more about it. Yes, I think so too. Can you help me figure out where I am? Jack asked hopefully. While Azure examined various strange devices and recorded information, he told Jack about his world. Jack sat on a chair or something similar and listened intently to Azure's story. Azure talked about the technologies they had developed and the progress they had made in exploring and understanding nature. Wow, that all sounds incredible, Jack said. I bet you guys have all these cool spaceships and airplanes to explore the stars, right? Azure nodded. Yes, we have developed advanced technologies to explore the vastness of the universe. I'm impressed, and I assume you also have all these artificial intelligences working for you? Yes, we have AI systems that support us in many tasks, Azure explained. I wonder if they can at least make coffee. Azure frowned. That is not a subject for jokes, Jack. Our technologies are very advanced and can perform many important tasks. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be disrespectful, but it's hard not to joke when you find yourself in such a foreign world. Azure nodded understandingly. I understand, but it's important that you abide by our rules and show respect towards our culture. Got it. "I'll do my best," said Jack. Despite his apology, Jack couldn't help but let slip a sarcastic comment from time to time as Azure continued to talk about his world. It was a sort of defense mechanism, a way of dealing with the unfamiliarity and foreignness he felt in this strange world. "This is all very interesting, but how do I get home?" Jack asked. "I'll do my best," replied Azure determinedly. "Let's go to my lab and run some more tests." Jack followed Azure to his lab as they continued to talk about the strange circumstances of their meeting. Although Azure didn't have human emotions, Jack couldn't help but appreciate his dry, factual manner. It was a welcome change from his usually impulsive and sarcastic nature. When they finally arrived at the lab, Azure began conducting a series of tests to find out exactly what had happened to Jack. After some time, Azure finally nodded. "I have good news. You are actually in another dimension." Jack stared at Azure in disbelief. "What the? How is that possible?" "It seems that your mission and the universe brought you here," replied Azure matter-of-factly. "But don't worry, we'll find a way to get you home." "Finally," said Jack and extended his hand to Azure. Chapter 5. And Another Experiment. Jack was thrilled when Azure told him that he would help him get back to Earth. He had already begun to get used to the idea of staying here forever, but Azure's offer was too tempting to refuse. "Okay, but what are you planning?" Jack asked suspiciously. "I'm going to perform a series of experiments on you to analyze your DNA and determine your origin," Azure said calmly. "Once we find that out, I might be able to bring you back." "DNA analysis sounds great," Jack said sarcastically. "Let me just catch my breath before you take me apart like a car on a workbench." Azure ignored Jack's comment and began the first round of tests. Jack was not thrilled as a series of samples were taken from him, but he persevered because he hoped it was what he needed to get back home. "That was the painful part," Jack said as the tests were finished. "What's next? Electroshock?" "That won't be necessary," Azure replied seriously. "I've gathered enough information to begin the analysis." Jack frowned as he watched Azure eagerly input data into his computer. He was curious about what Azure would find, but he was also nervous. What if he wasn't able to bring him back home? "So, how does it look?" Jack asked impatiently. "Can you bring me back?" Azure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the data on his computer. Jack's nervousness increased as the minutes passed by. "Azure? Interesting," Azure finally murmured. "Interesting? What the hell is interesting about me being stuck on a strange world?" "Your DNA is unusual. It's not from here," said Azure. "Not from here? What do you mean?" "It looks like you come from another dimension," said Azure. When Jack finds out from Azure that he's in another dimension, he's initially shocked. "Wait a minute, you are telling me I am not on the moon anymore?" Jack asked sarcastically. Azure only nodded affirmatively. "Yes, you are now in a parallel dimension." Jack shook his head and sighed. "That is great. Now I have to start a new career as an interdimensional traveler." Azure looked at him questioningly. "You don't seem concerned." Jack shrugged. "I'm a man who works on the moon. What could shake me?" Azure looked at him unperturbed. "I don't understand how you can joke about this." "Who says I'm joking?" replied Jack with a mischievous grin. "Maybe I'm just crazy." Azure didn't seem convinced. "I doubt that craziness is a possible explanation for your current situation." "Well, then I'll just have to live with it," replied Jack with a shrug. "But enough about that. What do you plan to do now? How can you send me home?" "I can explain it exactly to you," replied Azure determinedly. "I will have to perform a series of experiments to find out how to safely bring you back to your own dimension." Jack rolled his eyes. "Great, more experiments. This will be fun." Despite his sarcastic comments, Jack felt uneasy at the thought of the upcoming experiments. Would Azure hurt him? Would he ever be able to go home again? There were so many unanswered questions and uncertainties, but Jack knew he had to stay strong to get through everything. Chapter 6. An Unexpected Visitor. Jack was sitting on a sort of examination table while Azure put a sort of helmet on him. Jack looked at him skeptically. "What are you up to, Azure?" "I don't feel comfortable handing my brain over to an alien," Jack said sarcastically. "Don't worry, Jack. This is the experiment that will take you home," Azure replied seriously. "While your body is kept in stasis, I will send your consciousness through various realities until we find the one you originally come from." "Sounds great," Jack said ironically. "Hopefully I don't land in a bad version of the Matrix." Azure ignored Jack's comment and switched on the experiment. Jack felt a strange pull in his brain while he was sent through various realities. When he finally stopped, he looked around and realized he was in a world that was completely unfamiliar to him. "Okay, Azure, where am I now?" Jack asked. "This is another reality," Azure explained. "We have to keep searching to find your original reality." "Great," Jack said sarcastically. "I'm sure that'll be a real blast." As Azure continued conducting the experiment and sending Jack through various realities, Jack remained sarcastic and made comments about each new world he reached. Although Azure had no human feelings, he could sense Jack's sarcasm and sometimes found it amusing, although he didn't show it. "Hey, can't you just open a door for me and push me out?" "What is this, a torture chamber?" Jack complained when he returned to his body again from one of the dimensions. Azure ignored Jack's comments and focused on his work. Finally, after endless hours of experimentation, Azure seemed to have found a solution. "Good news, Jack. I think I finally found a way to send you home," Azure said seriously. Jack looked at Azure skeptically. "Really? How many times have you tried this?" Azure yet again ignored Jack's doubts and led him to a large machine in the center of the laboratory. Jack climbed into it and Azure began the experiment. But suddenly something strange and unexpected happened. Jack was standing in the middle of Azure's strange machinery when suddenly a huge bolt of pure energy appeared in front of them and enveloped them both.
Error 5637 CKHNY. XX has been found. Initiating corrections.
A metallic woman's voice spoke from the energy ball. It felt as if Jack's body was shaken by an invisible force. The machine began to hum and vibrate, and Jack was surrounded by a strong light. When the light faded, Jack was standing back on the moon, in his spacesuit, and his data pad was flashing with numerous messages from his colleagues. "Jack, where are you? Why aren't you answering?" "We're worried," read Jack from one of the messages. Jack smirked sarcastically. "Oh, you're worried? How sweet." He decided to leave his colleagues in the dark and only gave them sarcastic responses. He was still shocked about what had just happened, and he needed time to think about it. Jack looked up at the sky and wondered if he would ever see the strange creatures and the incredible laboratory again. But for now, he was just happy to be back on the moon. Epilogue. Jack stood again on the moon, in his spacesuit, and on his data pad blinked several messages from his colleagues who wanted to know where he had been and why he hadn't responded to their calls. Jack thought for a moment about what he should tell them. He couldn't, of course, tell them that he had been in another dimension, could he? He decided to keep it to himself for the time being and instead gave some sarcastic answers. "Oh, sorry, I had my phone switched off. I thought it would be quiet enough on the moon to be able to think in peace." Suddenly Jack felt a strange energy inside him, a remnant of the experiment Azure had conducted. The energy only gave off the sensation that it had been a mistake and needed to be corrected. Jack furrowed his brow and wondered what that meant. "Well, life is full of surprises," he said to himself. "I guess I'll just ignore it and pretend nothing happened." Jack remembered that he was actually on a mission when it all happened. It dawned on him that his late return could have consequences. He wondered how his colleagues would react. "They probably will fire me," he thought. Jack would have a lot to explain. And with these thoughts, Jack turned around and headed back to the rover.